Welcome, everyone. I am so happy to be here to moderate this session. My name is Gerard. I'm a project manager at Golden Point Solutions, and I also have some other endeavors that I'm heavily involved in. But today I'll be moderating this session for you. And let me introduce our speakers. I would like to start with Josh MacIntyre, who's the head of revenue operations at Grammarly, an AI-powered digital writing assistant with over 20 million daily active users. Josh's team manages all operations for the business for Grammarly's B2B product, Grammarly Business. We also have Reagan Attle. She is the Vice President of Marketing at Clio, the leading provider of cloud-based practice management software used by lawyers around the world. Also joining us is Kristoffer Hansen, who is Spear's co-founder and chief executive officer. At Spear, Kristoffer is leading a technology-driven team aiming to accelerate the shift towards efficient and accessible mobility by enabling anyone to plan, launch, and analyze smart transportation network in seconds. A native of Norway, Kristoffer moved to Canada to pursue his bachelor degree in integrated engineering at UBC in 2010. So those are our speakers. I'm super happy to have such a high caliber speakers with us today. And I will be moderating this session by asking a couple of questions, and we're going to simply have a chat about scaling B2B businesses. Now, I would like to start with the first question that I would ask first Josh to answer, and maybe other speakers can join in. Why choose B2B model when your product is already available for general public in B2C model?
Yeah, it's a great question, Gerard. It's one that we've been getting a lot. In short, the simplest way to look at it is stability, right? So any consumer product has a high level of churn. So someone tries it, people either use it or their use case ends, and then they move on to something else, and it may not be as applicable as their life circumstance and work circumstance time. Whereas a business purchase, in general, it's an annual purchase. It's very sticky revenue. As I'm sure all of you know at work, once your work gives you a piece of software, you typically use it, and it's really hard to switch off of it later on. So for us, it's also just a natural progression. So Grammarly is something, and it's a little rare in that sense, in that it's applicable to everything you do all the time, right? You can use it in your personal life, you can use it in your academic life, and your professional life. And so with that, if you think about our customer journey, it's actually just a natural progression of where it goes as a business. You use it in school, then you use it in your personal life, then you use it in your professional life individually. You can then eventually use it as a group, either your team, your department, or your entire company. So it's just a natural progression to make sure that Grammarly is available everywhere that you need to use it.
That is actually a very interesting point you're making, because I know for myself, I was a regular user who chose to use Grammarly with my day-to-day email writing, and now I'm using it for business purposes as well. But with that, my next question is, how do you obtain your first B2B customer? And that question I would first like to ask Kristoffer.
It's a good question. Yeah, as I just paint a little bit of a picture of the people on the panel here. So I guess from our side at Spare, we're a little bit earlier stage than potentially the other ones on the panel here. So, we're just transitioning out of founder-led sales now. And in terms of getting your first to B2B customers, I would say one of my biggest advice would be to not try to outsource this or even insource this to other people other than the founders or the core team, because you got to figure out what makes people actually think your product is good. What are the kind of things that they're saying, oh, this is good, this is not good, in order for you to really understand when should we actually devote real sales team on this. Because once you go down doing allocating real sales capabilities onto this, then you just got to continue going with that. There's no turning back. So it's really about doing the work while maybe, you know, like me, I didn't have a sales background before, so for me it was totally new field. But you know, you really need to do it. You need to do it yourself before you put it onto someone else.
And Josh, maybe from your perspective, when you were getting the very first B2B client, how did you position the product to meet the business needs rather than consumer needs?
We're a little unique with Grammarly in that since we had such a large consumer base, we could look at how people work to narrow down to, let's say, 4 or 5 different use cases, and from that develop our hypothesis on what the ideal kind of candidate or customer persona is. You may hear people throw around ICP. So that's what we did, was we nailed it down to 4 or 5, and then we went to market with it, and we actually called it our Sell to Learn project, where we were able to go and talk to existing Grammarly users, understand how they might use it at work, and then go and do a more traditional cold outbound sales process to nail it down even further to understand where we should focus initially. Now, that being said, if you go back to the previous startup I was at, where it was like a true B2B enterprise SaaS play, that's a little different, to Chris's point, where you have to take your time to actually understand when you're going to scale up, and that's much more around trying to get in front of the right people as efficiently and effectively as possible and have as much customer interaction and research done as possible.
That is actually quite interesting point you're making. Reagan, I have a question that I would like your answer with. Talking about business-to-business scale, the businesses need to know that your product exists and can solve their problem. What is the message that you typically have when you're trying to scale up? When you're getting that first customer and moving through your first couple of sales, and you don't have that portfolio, you don't have that referral network, how do you then enter to that first initial moment where you scale? What is the message that you're trying to have for your product? May I ask you to unmute your microphone? That's a
about that. Yeah, first time. It's got to be one of us, right? Yeah, I mean, the message. I think the message is highly variable on your product and the tool that you're trying to sell. But I think what the most important thing is to talk to your customers to understand what their pain points are, what's resonating, what problem are you solving, and how do you translate that at scale? How do you translate that to your first customer, to your second customer, to your third customer, to your fourth customer? And how do you keep adding that value? I don't, you know, for me, and I'm probably going to repeat this quite a few times, it's going to be about understanding and talking to your customers, making your customers insanely happy, whether that's the first one or the second one or the, 10,000th one. It really helps when you have that connection with your customers. You're solving their pain points, you're connecting with them on that pain point, and then that translates into your message, your positioning, and how do you go to market.
Thank you. You're making a very interesting point about having that relationship. It's salespeople that have that initial relationship that they built with the customer. Later on, it might move to account managers or product managers, but that initial step is the sales team. Kristoffer, maybe you can tell me a little bit more about transitioning or building your business such a way that you have that sales team to help you make that sale and that initial connection with customers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So the question being, how do you transition from founder-led sales to a sales team? Okay, yeah. This is obviously very dependent on what kind of business you're running, but from our side, we found it to be very good to find kind of what I would consider generalists in terms of who they are as people, because we weren't at the scale where we could have solution consultants and SDR teams or AEs, a VP of growth, and all of those things. So you got to kind of try to find packages of people that are kind of the next level from a founder who could have potentially founded their own company, but they chose to join an existing company instead, and use that as leverage to go into these more specialized roles. The way I see it is really you're going from this very generalist mindset to getting more and more specialized, and only recently that we've gotten into fairly specialized role on our team, at least.
It's very interesting. Josh, are there any differences in the scaling your sales team when it comes to getting people who sell B2C versus B2B?
Yeah, definitely is the short answer, right? And to Kristoffer's point, like who you're going to hire for that initial go-to-market for your product is going to be very different than who you are once you have, let's say, hundreds of sales reps, right? It's a very different process. It's much more specialized. It's much more about project management later on and understanding what the requirements are, the various stakeholders from your client. It also depends on who you're selling to, right? If you're selling to SMBs, it's a much faster, quicker turnaround time. Whereas if you're selling to massive enterprises, it can take 6 to 12 months for a typical sales cycle. You have to go through IT, procurement, legal, like it's a very different skill set. And so off the bat, like it's the same as what Kristoffer said for us, where our initial sales reps like need to be multi-tool people that can do everything and are comfortable with that. And hopefully like the point is they also enjoy it, right? You don't want to bring someone in and fit them into a role that doesn't make sense and it's not what they like to do. So hiring someone, let's say, and again, this is a generalization from like a massive company like a Salesforce or a Microsoft, might not be the best fit if you're a small startup. They may seem like they have a fantastic sales track record and they're probably a fantastic salesperson in that environment, but bringing them into a startup is fundamentally different. They're going to do everything from customer support, customer success, marketing aspects of it. They're writing their own copy for their outbound stuff they're doing, providing product feedback, like just a much different role. And that's why you see pretty high turnover too when it comes to people in those roles early on. Gerard, you're muted.
We can't hear you, Gerard.
Join the team. I guess my next question are going to be focusing more about scaling operations. So I'm going to sort of have a slightly the same question with slight flavors to each one of you. When it comes to scaling your operations alongside your sales capacity, are there any lessons learned? Or do you have any advice on trying to balance the scale between trying to sell too fast and being able to meet your at the same time? And I guess from direct sales and operations, I'll direct that question first to Josh, but I'm going to ask each one of you with slightly different flavors. So from operations point of view, Josh, how do you find that balance?
Clear the balance between scaling
your sales and operations. Like you can quickly oversell and sell too much, but then you need to be able to meet your obligations. How do you balance that internally when it comes to your operations?
Yeah, definitely. Good question. Again, one of the first things what you're doing as a business, right? And what you can actually afford to do. It's great to say you want to be slow and take time, but if you need to keep the lights on and keep people employed and make sure that they're receiving their salaries, like that changes things a bit. And so one thing that's very different early on from when you're, let's say, like a large company, is that sometimes you need to do things that just don't scale. You need to take on customers that you know are probably going to churn in a year or two because you need that cash in the door so that you could spend 80% of your time with the ones that maybe aren't paying you as much but are providing amazing product feedback, to Reagan's point earlier, right? So for us, again, a little bit different with our situation because we have a lot of customers that we could talk to early on, but at the last company I was at, we did just that. So we actually brought on a number of large enterprise customers that had really large, like 6-figure type deals that were on multi-year contracts, and it gives us that stability and that runway both from a money perspective but also from a time perspective to really dive into the high use product users and understand what they're getting out of it and what they want. I'd say from there you can then go back to looking at your sales cycle and understanding once it's repeatable, right? Like, are you seeing consistent purchases from the same type of ICP over time with relatively low lift from your internal team to get through there? You may be selling a ton, but if it takes 1 million people to do it and it's highly inefficient, it's not actually working, right? So it's it's really easy to get distracted by those if it's happening a lot, but understanding who that ICP truly is and whether or not they're actually having repeated purchases, that's really important. That's when you want to scale up.
Thank you for that. Reagan, when it comes to scaling for large enterprise, and I know that Clio is now serving clients of all sizes, but how do you find a balance between trying to find budget for marketing, budget for product development, for operations? How do you find that sweet spot where you have enough marketing to grow the business, but not just blow through your budget quickly and over quote unquote oversell? How do you find the balance in that aspect of running a business?
Yeah, so we have a set of KPIs that we measure, and we want to make sure that we're managing against them because we know that there's the economics of our business that make the most sense. At Clio, we have a set of clients that can be solo law firms, so one user, all the way up to hundreds of user law firms. And so our price point is actually very different. You could be $1,000 a year with us to hundreds of thousands of dollars a year with us. So the economics of the different parts of their business is quite different depending on the type of customer. So our challenge is how do we build models, or how do we build our efforts together to be able to accommodate that wide range. So when I think about marketing, the cost of acquiring a customer is really important. We want to make sure our CAC, so our CAC and our LTV ratios are ones that make sense, and we measure those on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis to make sure that we're not seeing trends that are out of norm or changing in a negative way. So I think it's important that you're really looking at the economics and the metrics that make sense for your business. What makes sense for Clio is probably very different than what makes sense for Grammarly, right? And refining those and paying attention to those and looking at those. And in the early days, that probably means every day, every week, depending on what you're trying to measure. Certainly in the beginning, your product investment and your investment on taking care of your customers should be the most important, and utilizing those marketing channels that have less cost associated with them would be what I would recommend, right? So that may mean you are ensuring that your SEO is really strong right from the get-go. That's essentially a free way to market your business, is to understand pain points, show up for those pain points when folks are searching for it, and being able to convert them that way. So again, you kind of have to pick where you want your initial investments are, where it makes sense in the early days to spend your dollars, and watch those metrics as you scale. Did that answer your question, Gerard?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, cost per acquiring a client. I think at the beginning, this is something that in my entrepreneurial career, I had to focus tremendously on, because having right now the Golden Point solution is the third business that I started. It's very easy to spend a lot of money on Google ads or on LinkedIn ads, but how many of those ads convert into paying customers, especially in the B2B market? Being an executive coach, I find that in the earliest stages of my business, word of mouth was far more effective than any advertising that I did. But my next question, staying in the same realm, is for Kristoffer. How do you balance at the beginning stages of your business your infrastructure needs and operational needs versus your ability to deliver? So, many products, like specifically software products, require some server infrastructure, and it's very easy to spend a lot of money on AWS early on. And I know of businesses who failed because they overpay initially because they were trying to make it too perfect and solve for every problem. That's just one of many examples. But when it comes to infrastructure in your kind of business, how do you balance purchasing just enough versus not too little or not too much and still be able to deliver on your service or product?
Right. This obviously very much depends on what kind of business you run. I would say we're in a little bit of a unique position because our customers depend highly on our application to be alive and running well. So maybe we overspend in the amount of infrastructure we have. But for us, kind of to Reagan's point there, it's really important to keep the customers you do have, right? So before you get new, you also need to make sure you have customers that are excited about what you're currently doing and see kind of the progression. And when things go wrong, you just got to be honest and be like, hey, we fucked up. We're not going to do it. We've learned our lesson. This is how we're going to fix it with step 1, 2, 3. And most of the time they will understand, and they will understand that, you will become better if you do become better, of course, and you will be able to, fix those things. Answering if you're overpaying in infrastructure, it's just really difficult to say. It really just depends on kind of what business you're.
Thank you. I find myself consulting a lot of small businesses, specifically in software sector, and often that sentiment of let's just put everything on AWS because it's easy is quite prevalent, and yet it's quite expensive. So that's why I'm asking those questions, because I think specifically when you starting your business, you have to be very careful where you spend that money.
I would say on that point though, I would say that this is very typical in the technology space, that you think of the ways you think of solving a problem is by adding more technology to it, and that might not always be the truth. You could think of like, how could I do this manually before I add on a layer of technology on it? That could be one way of saving some of your infrastructure cost.
Very good point. Talking about technology and tools, I guess my next set of questions are going to be revolving around that. Reagan, what tools do you personally use that help you make better decisions? There might be software tools or just mental models. Anything you can share that helps you make better decisions?
So I'm going to come at this question from more of a small, it's from the startup perspective, because at the stage that Clio's at right now, I probably have almost too many tools at my disposal. There is no shortage of tools to make decisions. I think early on, or the most critical ones for me are, so certainly you want to make sure you have a good understanding of your customers and your potential customers. And so having a CRM system, obviously I would recommend Salesforce at any size, allows you to get that visibility and that kind of single source of information. You can extend that with something like Zendesk, or some customer service tool when you're ready. But having that central source is really important. Google Analytics is really helpful for understanding traffic. Like it's a free tool. You can understand traffic to your website. You can understand conversion rates. You can understand everything that you need to know about how someone's interacting with your brand or the parts of the brand that you own really easily and for free. So I would definitely recommend something like that. Again, you're going to get more visibility as you go up, but I'd say for me, those would be the most important things right off the bat. There's obviously financial systems that you also want to pay attention to as well.
And I guess I will have a similar question to Josh. When it comes to your side of operating Grammarly, what tools do you use or would you recommend, not only at the early stages, but even right now when you're in sort of a mid-tier or enterprise level? What tools do you use to help you make better decisions?
Yeah, I'll break it up into both those kind of realms that you mentioned there. So both the early startup and now. And so Reagan hit it on the head when it came to like a CRM being your single source of truth, right? Like you need somewhere that everything flows into, that records everything that you can pull from and be confident in. Similar to your point as well, obviously we have very aligned views on this, but like Salesforce is what you're going to use if you scale to any considerable size. So if you can afford to go on it earlier rather than later, the cost of switching from say a HubSpot or a Copper or something is extremely high. If we can, they have a lot of programs for small companies too that make it much more affordable than the like $150 a month you typically see when you look at it just on their website with the sticker price. But if I had to bake that down, aside from the CRM, the one thing that I would have early on, it's what we did at my last company, is just either Google Sheets or Microsoft Excel, right? Or I guess Office now, it's all bundled. And then I would look at a website called forentrepreneurs.com. So it's run by the managing partner in Matrix Partners out of Boston. It's a guy named David Skock. You may have heard of the SaaSer conference that a lot of founders on the call here have probably seen or read blog posts about, so he founded that as well. And so if you go in there, he has an entire blog post called SaaS Metrics 2.0, and it lays out everything that you can measure in a SaaS business. It's skewed towards B2B, so keep that in mind. And that will allow you to get an idea of what you should be tracking and decide what makes sense. And then he also has downloadable templates and models that you can come and just plug in your figures. And once you get that set up, have that connected with some type of finance thing, whether it's Xero is what we used at my last company. Obviously, it's a lot different at Grammarly. We're a much larger business. But those are kind of the bare bones things that I would have, and that allows you to measure all the different unit economics that you'd want to know. Reagan mentioned a couple earlier, like lifetime value, cost of acquisition, sales efficiency is another one that we look at pretty heavily to understand performance, and then a bunch of product metrics as well. Now, as we move up market and say we move into what we use now at Grammarly, our stack is pretty complex. Part of that is the needs of our B2B business, and the other part of it is that we do have to integrate really heavily with the B2C business, and that's growth that we made very intentionally. We did a bunch of things to support that growth. One in particular is like moving here to Vancouver in the first place. We opened the office here, we hired a bunch of B2B roles, and we're continuing to invest in that growth. But then from a tools perspective as well, it allows us to have like Salesforce as our baseline. We use Outreach.io for our sales engagement tools. We're bringing in Pardot on the marketing automation side, NetSuite on the finance side. Like it's a pretty complex stack with 10 or 11, almost 12 tools at this point. Wouldn't recommend going there off the bat. It's not what you need. Do it simply and do it by hand for as long as you can.
Thank you for bringing on that point. I find myself in a somewhat similar situation, being a small business owner, just a couple of employees. My initial reaction was, well, let's just get a Salesforce. But it is costly. I don't want to use the word expensive because it's not. It delivers tremendous amount of value. But it might be hard to extract all of that value early on. So using Google Sheets and Jira in particular, somewhat modified to help with business processes rather than just software, helps quite a lot. But I guess, Kristoffer, being a slightly smaller business, at least at this current stage, what tools do you use that help you at that early stage of your business?
Yeah, I mean, we have also converted to Salesforce. So not sure if we can talk too much about something else at this point, but I would say probably one of the most underutilized tools is a good phone plan of trying to actually talk to those initial customers and get more of them. I think especially in the technology industry, we focus a lot on all of these kind of optimization tools, and we kind of forget about that it's actually humans that we're selling to. So just getting better on being on the phone and not hesitating on being on the phone. I found that text messages is actually a really good sales tool. I think, in this day and age, we're talking a lot about just like ways to get in touch with new customers and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of noise in those aspects too. So back to the basics, I would say, it's a good way to start out, and then you can invest in all of these fancy things afterwards.
That's a very interesting point. I know of a business, basically a clothing store, that runs only through WhatsApp. There is no website. There
Yeah.
is no, basically, there is no other infrastructure other than a WhatsApp. It's a group you can join and you can leave, and you buy clothes by someone taking a photo and basically negotiating like you would on a regular outdoor market where you just go and buy stuff off the rack on the spot. But that's a very interesting golden nugget. And I guess my next question for Regan is going to be, what lessons did lessons learned, but in a positive aspect, what is something that you know that you could recommend startups or medium-sized businesses as a good practice, something that went well when you were scaling Clio, that you can ask people to repeat?
Yeah, so I think there was two things on Clio's side. One was just this hyper focus on our customers, right? Our co-founders were on the phone with our customers. They were, answering support calls in the early days. They were coding on the phone to help that customer solve that problem immediately. So it was a really, really customer-centric focus in the early days, and we didn't let that go. That is one of our core values. It's one of the things that we care the most about. We invest in a large support team to be able to provide that one-on-one support that we know our customers need. So that, again, just making the customer at the center of your universe, focusing on making them insanely happy. We've grown. We have a really high retention rate, and we've grown through referrals because of it. So I will not stress that enough. I probably won't stop talking about it. And you hear all of us kind of bring that in quite a bit. So I think there's definitely something there. And the second thing is for us was establishing in the early on what type of employees we wanted to have and what type of culture Clio wanted to have. Clio is actually known for our culture and for how we treat our employees and for how our employees engage with our company, how we support our employees, how they help grow our business is really, really important to us. We had a set of values in the early days, and while they've been refined and evolved as our company's grown, the core essence of what we care about and how we treat our employees hasn't. And we've gone, from 2 people to 500, 550 now. Your employees are if you're a founder and you used to talk to your customers, it gets passed on to your employees. You want to make sure that they're showing up for your customers the same way that you would. How the teams work together, the level of effort that they put in is all based on what they value in your company and how you support them. So to us, those are the 2 things that matter the most. I don't want to take away from our product, invest in your product and making sure it solves those customers' pain points, making sure that you're doing right by your customers, you're investing, you're delivering is also extremely important, but I still put that in the lens of focusing on your customers and focusing on your employees, because they both contribute to that.
Very interesting point. And one I would like to stress out even more is having a good reputation really helps. Being part of Vancouver tech scene, I work as a project manager. I sometimes jump between companies based on the product and project needs. But I can attest to the fact that Clio has a very good reputation here in Vancouver as one employer, but also as a product and service provider.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you. Kristoffer, Reagan made a very good point about having the right people, and you touched on this with one of my earlier questions, having the right people in your sales team to begin with. But maybe what I can ask you is expand on lessons learned on finding the right people or good people. Is there any golden nuggets that you can share with us there?
It takes more time than you think. That's a good thing that I learned a lot. Yeah, I mean, finding good people is kind of like dating. You might need to do it a lot before you find the right person. So it really depends. And I also think it helps to list down what you think it takes to be a good person. Like, what are kind of the attributes that you're looking for? Because it's what I found that, and I'm not sure what the other panelists here I found is like, it's very easy to talk to certain candidates and be like, wow, okay, I hadn't it's a little bit in parallel, but this is really interesting, but it could come and bite you in the ass in the future. So it's really good to list down what your ideal candidate looks like before you start looking at them, even if it's just a guess, because that's honestly how most things are in startup. It's just a guess until you actually start proving it out. So I think, and that it takes more time than you think.
That's a very good point. Knowing from the perspective of a PM, when I assemble a project team, it might take a while. I think this is one of the things that everyone forgets. Building a team from available resources versus the best resources for the project makes a massive difference. But I would like to ask a similar question to Josh. Any golden nuggets that you can share with us from either earlier stages or somewhere around the time when you're right now in scaling B2B specifically?
Yeah, for sure. I think one generalization, and Kristoffer and Reagan both touched on it, is like understanding the profile of who you want to hire for, and that's not just in terms of the experience that they have. The way that we measure it is across 4 areas, which is the values, talents, skills, and knowledge that someone needs, and being very explicit before you open a role to know what you're looking for. One, because it'll help you identify those people a lot faster, and secondly, it also helps you avoid bias. Right? It's really easy to meet someone that did an MBA at Harvard and they're very impressive, but they may not actually fit the role that you're looking for, and you're just impressed by how smart or intelligent they are. So I think it's really important to have that profile set down right off the bat so that whoever you're talking to, you can objectively look at them and understand whether or not they fit the role. In general, like your first 3 hires, especially in a sales org, are going to have a massive impact, more than the 30th or 50th or 300th hire that you make, right? So take it really slow at the start and take longer than you need to hire those first people, because they're going to set the precedent not only with your customers, but also the culture internally. It can drastically change what that looks like. And then I would say, in general,
I think you're muted, Gerard.
Technical difficulties. I think that should be the hashtag of 2020, not review, but technical difficulties.
Great tip for Zoom calls. Also call into the phone number if you don't have good internet.
This is one lesson that I learned in the last year of running business, is not to over rely on technology. Sooner or later, it will fail just because of nature of how internet and work. But I would like, I guess Josh is going to reconnect in just a second, and I might get back to him on those lessons learned. But I guess my next question is going to be somewhat similar, but from a different perspective. What was the biggest obstacle or the most challenging obstacle that you had to overcome? And I will start with Reagan. Something that you thought would be easy and it turned out to be hard, or something that you did not know how to tackle and then your team helped you solve. Share with us an obstacle that you overcame that small businesses might come across.
Ooh, there's obstacles everywhere. I think I think for us, and just if you, I'm going to come from the marketing lens, from the go-to-market perspective, really change. So if you're building a product that is requiring your customer base to change the way that they've historically done something, in Clio's case, it's how they run their law firm, and you're requiring that change when they adopt your software, then you've got to really understand what would motivate them to take that change. You've got to really understand what would help them make that change, so you can correctly position yourself, and you can correctly support them. Change is probably one of the hardest things to overcome when you're trying to get adoption, because it is a core intrinsic way someone behaves, believes they should behave, and it factors in a lot of time and effort to change. So I think, as Clio scales, change was hard to get one customer to change, and it was hard to get 1,000 customers to change, and it was hard to get 100,000 customers to change. And as you scale through that, you're going to go through different types of folks and different types of challenges in the way that they perceive change. So making sure that you're staying on top of that, understanding what they need, understanding what they want, understanding how you can solve that for them, or you can make that easier for them, is going to be an obstacle that I think you have to overcome at each part of your scaling journey. It's not the same as it was to get your first customer as it is to get your 100,000 customer. It's actually, you tend to be talking to a different level of maturity type customer at this point. So I wouldn't say we've overcome it, but it's something that we're constantly overcoming and constantly looking to solve for.
I think it's a very interesting point. Whenever a new product comes to the market, people not only need to learn about its existence, but also how to use it and how it solves their problem. I think you were touching on that point earlier, that your product needs to solve a problem. I remember when iPhone came out, and it was a problem that no one really had, but look where we got with the smartphone products, how it tremendously. And I think it came down to a very good message and also a very good product to begin with. But talking about that early stages, Kristoffer, maybe there is a lessons learned that you can share with us on overcoming certain obstacles at the early stages of the business.
Mm-hmm. I think from us, I mean, this is obviously a while ago, but we, as a all technical team, we had kind of the thinking that, if you build it, they will come, which is obviously completely false. If anyone in the audience thinks this is true, this is totally false, especially in B2B sales, because, if you build it, they don't know about it. You need to tell people about it. And really, the challenge being, how do you as an all technical team actually embrace sales as a profession and something you guys got to get to know how to do, and something to get somewhat good in, or at least achieve something results. And also thinking that, I would also say that one of the things that we really learned is that there's a lot of, you probably have heard this quote saying, sales solve everything. And I would say that's probably 100% true, is that it actually does solve everything. Everything kind of, you won't get anywhere unless you actually deploy your products into actual customers and get them to pay for it, because that's how you actually get to a real business. So that was obviously a very big challenge to us initially, and something, there's all these phases. I think that was kind of what Reagan was highlighting. challenges never stop. They just like enter different phases, and that was definitely something that we had to kind of learn the hard way initially.
Thank you. And you're making a great point that in a business, challenges never stop. It's just that they move from one challenge to another. And I guess it's a similar question for Josh. Could you share with us maybe a lessons learned from scaling B2B versus scaling B2C? Because I think Grammarly is in that unique position where you have products for both. Is there a lessons learned that you can share with us from that perspective?
Yeah, for sure. The initial one is how the sales cycle actually works, right? Like B2C can be very much hands-off. You can automate a lot of it. You can use stuff like Google Analytics. You can understand how people are interacting with your products and take a much more quantitative approach. Whereas on the B2B side, you need to be more comfortable with less quantitative, not no quantitative, but less and much more qualitative. And that goes back to the customer research point that we've all handled, right? Like if you're selling to one person, you're not actually selling to one person. Maybe selling to one person who's buying on behalf of 10,000 people. And just because a business is buying your product doesn't mean everybody even within that business are going to use it the exact same way. Whereas in the B2C world, you're selling to an individual. They're making the decision, like they are the CEO, VP of marketing, legal counsel, they're everything for themselves, right? So you're marketing based on more demographic data and how they interact as a group with whatever your product is. And then secondly, the product data that you can get from a B2C product, usually you can scale up a little bit faster and get more product signal. Whereas on the B2B side, you have less customers off the bat, and it takes more time to get them onboarded to get that signal. So back to that same point from earlier, like you need to be more comfortable with qualitative over quantitative in the early stages. And then once you reach a particular scale, yes, you can get into understanding who your product, how to refine that product offering. And to everyone, like in general, there's no magic point, whether like my last company, I was the 7th employee, this one I was the 100th, now we're 400 people. There's never a time where you don't have problems. You just move from one set of like acceptable problems to the next, to the next, to the next, and you keep going. Like Amazon still has problems, Microsoft still has problems, right? So don't think you're just gonna come over the wall and all of a sudden it's easy. It's not. You maybe just move into much more specialized problems that take a lot more time and effort, which is something to keep in mind.
Thank you for that. We're slowly coming to the end of the session, and I would like to take a few questions that I picked up from the chat, and I'm going to ask you guys. So first question that I would like to ask is, I will start with Reagan because it was mentioned in a question, but maybe all of you can chip in. So the question comes from Jenny Knudler. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced that, Jenny. But the question is, Reagan said it's super important to talk to and understand your customers. If you're a business, how do you approach them to give their feedback? Are most of them willing to give you their, in quotes or in brackets, unpaid time and provide insights and feedback for you to further improve your product? So I think it's a great question, and I think I would like to ask all of you to chip. I will start with Reagan.
Yeah. So, how do you approach, to answer the first part of the question? How do you approach them? Email or you call them. Both of them work really well. Kristoffer mentioned texting too, so I'm sure you could try that if you have the relationship with them already. It isn't hard. In my experience, it hasn't been hard to get customers to give you their time and even their unpaid time. If you're solving problems for them, if you're solving their problems, if you're building a relationship, if you loop back and tell them how valuable their feedback is and how you use that to make a decision. If they're already customers with you, they want you to improve your product. And I actually found that hasn't changed. That hasn't changed from being a startup to an established company. Your customers want you to build a great product for them, and if they understand that you're you're asking this and you're actually using that information to build a better product, and you're establishing that connection with them, they will continue to give you your time, in my experience. You'll get no's, and that's okay. You just ask another customer or ask another potential customer. It's a very, very rare occasion where we'll incentivize somebody to talk to us. It's almost never happens where we need to incentivize somebody to talk to us, because again, that willingness is there from seeing a potential outcome.
Thank you. I would like to ask Josh and sort of put a little question. Your product is driven, so I assume AI learns about what works and what doesn't to a certain degree, I suspect. But talking in a business-to-business model, how do you approach business from that perspective, where the product almost learn itself, yet you still need business feedback? How do you approach that aspect?
Yeah, it's a great question, Gerard. One important thing to remember is most folks think of AI as this kind of super complex thing that's just basically going to do everything on its own, right? But at the end of the day, humans are building the models, and humans also need to keep checks and balances on these models. So we're fortunate in that with our B2C business, yes, we get a lot of insight from that aspect of it. But at the end of the day, just because a large group of people appear to be doing something based on the data doesn't mean it's actually driving value for your customer, especially in the B2B market, right? Different businesses have different use cases, and it doesn't necessarily translate. So again, tying that back to understanding who your ICP is super important off the bat. You may have 6 customers, and that may maybe 6 fundamentally very different ones, and they may be completely unrelated when it comes to how they use your product. I'd say in general, you still need to talk to your clients, because at the end of the day, you need to understand what they're actually doing and why they're actually using it. And then from a more AI perspective, we also need to make sure that we're keeping tabs to make sure that we're not promoting bias or anything like that within our algorithms. If we sign, let's say, a massive company with 100,000 employees started using our product early on, like that would massively skew our data and not necessarily act representatively for the rest of our users or the rest of the folks around the world that could potentially use this. So it's important to keep that kind of check and balance in place. And AI is great, but it's always AI with a human in the loop. And that's why we have a massive team of analytical linguists and individual PhDs who are applied researchers. They're extremely important to our success, even though we do have AI underpinning our product.
Thank you for that. I think it's very interesting. And to your and Reagan point, in my perspective, paying someone for their feedback can very heavily skew it, because people then might feel obligated to say something positive and might not effectively reflect their opinions. So having that feedback when you ask for it but not pay for it actually might yield better results. But I want to sort of ask for Kristoffer's perspective on it as well. After implementing your product or delivering your service, how do you make that initial approach to that customer? You said that you tried texting and had good results, but I would feel somewhat reluctant to say to my customer, hey, can I text you about feedback? How do you build that relationship so that you can ask them for that?
Well, I mean, it totally depends. It depends on what kind of relationship you have with these people. Some will prefer one way and some will prefer another way. And you just got to learn, if we were together in a social setting, I would know how to best get in touch with you, Gerard, how to get best in touch with Josh, and how to best get in touch with Reagan. So, I mean, you got to just customize it to your audience, and you got to develop probably before you ask them, hey, can I ask you for feedback on, my product? You might want to try and develop some kind of relationship with them to get to that point, right? To develop that kind of a relationship. And to Reagan's point, I would say ask more than rarer, because you're gonna get no's, and that's that. You're gonna get more no's than you're gonna get yeses in all kinds of B2B. So it's better just ask more than not.
Thank you for that. There's one more question that I wanted to ask, but anyone listening to this session or anyone in the chat, obviously we're not going to get to all of your questions, but I highly encourage you to engage with our panelists through the Hopin platform. If you click on the People tab on the right-hand side, you can search for them and you can message them. Feel free to connect with all of us over LinkedIn as well. This is the best way to stay in touch. But my next question is somewhat specific, but I think very important. Andrea Lindo asks, how important are product designers for your business when you're just starting? So that initial design, how important is it to have it right? Maybe I can ask with Josh first. Grammarly doesn't have specific user interface. There is just that little dot in the bottom telling you that you have some things to correct, and there is a little pop-up, so that the interface for Grammarly is not that obvious. So maybe from your perspective, what do you think about that initial design?
Yeah, fair question. So Grammarly actually has a number of different interfaces. I think it's around 15 or 16 now. So the extension, yes, we provide it exactly where you're using it within the text box. But if you select that little G, it'll pop up a user interface that sits on top of your page. We have a web app, a desktop app, mobile apps for Android and iPhone. You actually have a ton. So to tie that back to the original question, like product designers are very important early on. But in the early days, I would just stick to one, and someone that's like deeply tied to your mission and your vision, because you need someone that can architect the entire user experience really seamlessly. As soon as something breaks, like similar to a marketing funnel, folks are just going to drop out of your leaky bucket, right? So it's really important to make sure in the early days that even if your product doesn't provide a ton of value, it's at least seamless with how people move through it, use it, and get what value it does have out of it. Because as soon as they run into stuff that they think are bugs or poor UI, early on, especially if it's a product that people aren't familiar with and you're trying to educate them on what it does, you're just going to have massive drop-off rates, high amounts of churn. So very important product designers early on.
Thank you for that. Reagan, any points you want to share with that as well?
I just agree with Josh. I think to every point he made, the user experience is really critical, and so where you can have a designer lean into that and to support that, I think is important.
Amazing. Well, we're basically out of time. Thank you all so much for the valuable feedback that all of you provided. Thank you for answering all of my questions.